Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Strengthen Bonds, Abolishing the Child Welfare System and Re-envisioning Child Well-Being. I'm Jane Spinnick, and I'm here with my co-chair, Nancy Polikoff. We hope that many of you were able to join us last night for our keynote with Dorothy Roberts and a very inspiring panel in response to her presentation. If you were unable to join us last night, if you go to the Strengthen Bonds website, you will be able to scroll down to the bottom, and the keynote and the introductions and the panel are all there and will be available to review at any point. Our panels today and tomorrow are on Zoom, and so it will take us a little while to be able to have the recordings available, but they will be. So let me say good morning again. We had a very formal introduction last night, and we said thank you to all the people who have been so great about supporting us during the preparation for the symposium, particularly because, as many of you know, we postponed the symposium in March. So we're very excited that we were able to reconvene so quickly in June. I am going to take a moment right now to acknowledge and to say that Columbia Law School acknowledges and recognizes the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger peoples, whose original nations comprise the lands on which Columbia University was built. Since this is a virtual conference, you may want to make that acknowledgement yourself wherever you are. And it helps us to recognize that we are all living in a place that we have been able to I guess the thing I would say is that, unfortunately, requires us to acknowledge that this is what we did, but it is still important for all of us to recognize that this helps us to understand where we are. Today, we are going to have 4 loaded panels. The program is available for you. There is detailed bios of all of our speakers and moderators, so we're not going to take much time to introduce people, but they are a very exciting group at each of the 4 panels today. As you will recognize when you look in the program, we thought it was essential when we were choosing the participants to have as broad a range of those involved in this family regulation system as possible. We have impacted parents and youth. We have activists and organizers, advocates of all sorts, academics and practitioners, all of us coming together to think about, at this moment, how do we transform, not reform, but transform the way in which we support families and children so that we make sure that we are ensuring the well-being of children, but the well-being of families and communities too. Just a couple of bits of business to make sure that you know about. and that will be reinforced through the day. In order for you to participate in the, with questions in the panel, in the chat function, you can send questions to the moderator. That is of each panel. That is how we're going to be able to allow you to participate. And Nancy is going to talk a little bit now about the breakout rooms that we've created, with the hope that we can simulate a little bit what a real conference would be like, to give you a chance to interact. Again, thank you for joining us. We are very, very excited about your participation. We want you to know that over 2,000 of you have registered, and we hope that both today and going forward, this is going to be a moment to really make a difference and figure out the ways in which we're going to really change the family regulation system and create something new. Nancy?
Thank you, Jane. It's a pleasure to see everybody who is here this morning. I want to start by saying a little bit about the keynote last night, which, as Jane said, is available for everybody to view. We are here for these 2+ days to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, a book that was transformative for the field and that brought to the attention of anyone who read it that the system, as it was 20 years ago, did not promote the welfare of children and in fact caused grave harms to children, and that those harms were racialized in nature. 20 years later, as I said last night, if anybody had listened to what Dorothy Roberts had said and actually been able to fix the problems, we would be here taking a victory lap. In fact, we are not. We are here to talk about making completely different choices about how we promote the welfare of children, tribes, and communities and families. And Dorothy last night described her path to becoming a family policing abolitionist. And one of the things she talked about was the attempt to bring reforms to the system over the last 20 years, some of which she participated in, and how little difference they have really made in the operation of the system. She also described the work of prison abolitionists, their deep thinking and their actions and their development of non-reformist reforms, and how that had influenced her development as an abolitionist of what she refers to as the family policing system. Jane and I refer to it as the family regulation system. We all agree it's misnamed to call it the child welfare system because it is not a system that promotes the welfare of children. Finally, Dorothy talked about the important organizing being done by parent advocates and system-affected parents and youth, and the impact that that has had on the development of an abolitionist movement. We wanted to make sure, as Jane said, that all constituencies were, and all disciplines were represented among the papers in the conference last night and over the next 2 days. Last night, we had a keynote by a prominent law professor, followed by 4 responders, none of whom were lawyers or law professors, but people with activist experience, with lived experience in the system, and with an interdisciplinary approach to looking at the issues that we're looking at. So I'm very grateful to Gwendolyn Alfonso, Laura Briggs, Penthea Burns, and Leda Garcia Greenewald for agreeing to be responders on the keynote panel last night. And again, if you weren't here for that, please, you can watch it at any break or in the evening. It available now at the bottom of the screen for the conference website. Finally, I want to just explain a little bit about the breakout rooms. The moderators of each of the panels will be giving you more instructions about this, but in an attempt to give you an opportunity to speak individually to panelists after the panel, and also to meet with each other based on your interest geographically, based on the discipline you're in or other affinity groups, there will be a very large number of breakout rooms that you can choose to go to in any of the breaks right after every panel today and at the end of the day. And we encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity in the same way that you might go up to the front of the room if we were in person to ask a question of the speakers afterwards, or you might find yourselves at the coffee break table or in the hallways speaking to people who share interests that are similar to yours. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to our first panel is that all of the papers that you're going to be hearing over the next 2 days are going to be published in the Columbia Journal of Race and Law. It's going to take 2 issues to publish all the papers. The first one should be out shortly. The next one will be out in the fall. You can go to the website of the Columbia Journal of Race and Law to find those papers. They will all be available online, and we are so grateful to the editors and staff of the Columbia Journal of Race and Law for making sure that this important work is memorialized forever in scholarship and contributes to the development of work in this field. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn us over to the moderator of today's first session, Jessica Dixon Weaver. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning, Nancy. Good morning, Jane. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending this morning. I'm really excited about the first panel, and I am going to cover a few logistics that actually Nancy and Jane covered pretty well, but just for those who might not have heard about the logistics with regard to the questions and answers period, like how you submit your questions. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please submit them via the chat to me only, and then I will get to as many questions as I possibly can once the roundtable discussion wraps up. Also, for the breakout sessions, once we get to 12:45, I will announce the specific rooms that each of the panelists will be in. There will be 4 rooms, and you can break out into one of those 4 rooms between 12:45 and 1 p.m., which is like our coffee break. So as mentioned earlier, you can go into those rooms to talk directly to the panelists about their paper or about anything they said during the roundtable discussion. Also, for those of you all who may not have updated Zoom, if you have a problem getting into the breakout room in that you can't select it on your own, all you need to do is send a chat to someone with AV, audiovisual, in front of their name. We have about 4 AV administrative assistants assisting us during this time, and they will put you in the room that you would like to be in. All right, again, any questions, send them directly to me. So the first panel is entitled Legal Frameworks That Perpetuate Family Regulation. And we heard last night how the family regulation system works, and we know that there are laws, both federal and state, in place that keep the system running. And so we have a wide variety of panelists today, and I'd just like to introduce them just by name and title, and also the title of the paper that they are writing to be published in the Columbia Journal of Race and Law. So our first set of panelists are Angela Olivia Burton and Angeline Montauban, and they wrote together the paper Delinking Child Abuse Prevention from Family Wellbeing. Angela is Director of Quality Enhancement and Parent Representation in the New York State Office of Indigent Legal Services. And Angeline is a community activist and a mother. The next panelist I would like to highlight is Martin Guggenheim. Martin is the Fiorello LaGuardia Professor of Clinical Law and co-director of the Family Defense Clinic at the New York University School of Law. His paper is entitled, How Racial Politics Led Directly to the Enactment of the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, the worst law affecting families ever enacted by Congress. Our next panelist is Miriam Mack, who is Policy Counsel for the Family Defense Practice in the Bronx Defenders. Her title, the paper title is The White Supremacy Hydra, How the Family First Prevention Services Act Reifies Surveillance, Control, and Punishment in the Family Regulation System. Last but not least, we have Michael S. Wald, who is Professor of Law Emeritus at Stanford Law School. And the name of his paper is Beyond CPS, Building a New System to Protect and Promote the Safety and Development of Children. So today, instead of having each of the panelists talk specifically about their paper, we decided that we would do a roundtable discussion. And so this will be an 85-minute roundtable, and I will frame the questions and sometimes direct them specifically to a panelist, and then other panelists will chime in the discussion. So we welcome you in the audience to put questions forth. And again, we'll get to them at the end of the roundtable. So the first question goes to Angeline. And we've talked about this as far as the title or how we refer to Child Protective Services. In the past, the system responsible for protecting children from abuse and neglect has been called numerous names, including the child welfare system, the child protection system, children in need system, foster care system, etc. Even prior to the moment of racial reckoning in the summer of 2020 following George Floyd's murder, Professor Dorothy Roberts was calling for the abolishment of the family regulation system, a system that she called racist 20 years ago in Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. Why do you feel it is important to change the language we use to refer to this system?
Thank you for this wonderful question, Jessica Weaver. I would like to begin by thanking Dean Lester, Professor Spinek, Professor Polikoff, and to all of the editors, including Nicholas Galvain and Vinay Patel. I would also like to thank my co-writer, Angela Burton, my co-panelists who are all here, and the wonderful Jessica Dixon Weaver for moderating this panel. So to answer your question, so we have for years referred to it as the child welfare system. The term child welfare is partly responsible for all the abuses. We all want to protect children, and we will do everything in our power to protect children. So the system has been able to hide and abuse families in the name of child welfare. Child welfare as a term reinforces the idea that children need to be protected from their families. It drives off the idea that in order to keep children safe, we need family separation through forceful removals, criminalizations of families, foster care, court system involvement, load of useless services, and termination of parental rights. So Alan Detlaff, who is a professor at the University of Houston, has a great quote. He said, foster care does not provide care, and child protective services does not provide protection. Foster care is part of the carceral state that responds to problems by locking people in cages. Whether that cage is a prison cell, a detention center, or a foster home. This is all happening because of child welfare. So we know that most of these cases are neglect cases related to poverty. So why do children need to be protected from their families? The truth is they don't. Rather, our children need to be protected from the system. And this is why I fought to get my son out. I knew that he couldn't possibly lead and live a normal life if he stayed in the family destruction system for too long. The child welfare system is a system that terrorizes and criminalizes parents, and it can't and will never promote child well-being. A system built on the infrastructure of trauma and pain can't possibly be in the best interest of children, and should not be referred to as child welfare. It is impossible to protect children without supporting their families. And I will repeat, it is impossible to protect children without supporting their families. Since 2020, the language changed to refer to the child welfare system as family policing system, family surveillance system, family regulation system. I personally refer to it as the family destruction system, since the goal, it seemed, is to destroy our families. America, from its inception, has thrived off the destruction of the Black family. From the slave trade, we know that family was a major institution in the continent of Africa. Family, to me, is the most important institution. If you can destroy our families, there is nothing else that you can't do to us. So my overall point here is this country has always been comfortable with destroying the Black family. Right now, in our time, child welfare is the new excuse. I'm not sure why it is referred to as the child welfare system, since children who have experienced foster care in their lives have the worst outcome in every aspect of their lives. Higher rates of teenage pregnancy, higher rates of incarceration, and higher rates of dropping out of high school. Lastly, the language is very manipulative. They are able to do it to us, disproportionately people of color, because it is in the name of keeping children safe. Our children will never be safe in the system. I have been fighting CPS since 2014, before all of the hashtags and all of the new calls to abolish. I was one of the first abolitionists before it became popular to be an abolitionist. I have been invested in helping families. The system in place is not working. It should be abolished, and we should not refer to it as the child welfare system.
All right, if any of the other panelists would like to chime in to say what they either wrote about or in response to Angeline's statements about the system and what we call it.
Hi, I'm Michael Wald. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel, and for, as Angeline said, thanks to all of the people who have been involved in all of this. I've been involved in efforts to develop a well-functioning, quote, child welfare system for over 50 years. From the beginning, I argued that there should be a very limited role for CPS as part of a system for helping children. Yet 50 years later, the CPS system has grown 20-fold, impacting the lives of at least a third of all of the children in the United States. And sadly, as Dorothy pointed out last night, as Angeline has just indicated, all of the problems that we were worried about 50 years ago are as great today as they were then. The system has been particularly harmful to African American and Native American children, as Dorothy has documented, starting with Shattered Bonds in her prodigious work afterwards. I believe, though, that we are at, for the first time, a point where the large part of the field is ready to make major changes in how we approach the promotion of child welfare. How we frame that issue is very, very important. Since the framing is the first step in changing ideas about what to do regarding an issue. The framing of an issue shapes ideas on the nature of the issue, who or what is responsible for causing a problem or an issue. Importantly, who is assigned responsibility for addressing it, and the attitudes of the providers who are tasked with doing something. Framing also strongly influences legislators and the public's view of an issue, which affects their willingness to fund solutions. As Angeline pointed out, and Miriam and Angela and other papers, the framing of the child protection system has been very detrimental. It lets us believe that all of the 7 million children referred to CPS suffer from abuse or neglect. The frame identifies the problem as the pathological behavior by parents that lies within the individual and who are blameworthy. Unfortunately, the public's vision of these parents has been worsened by national campaigns to prevent child abuse. A long time ago, was on the first committee for the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse, but we continue to have committees to prevent child abuse. This has an impact on how everybody thinks about the system, as well as the family's self-view and attitudes toward the system. We need to change that frame. It has led to a false vision of the parents and also absolves the need for society to address the underlying causes that impair child's welfare. Thus, I think a critical task for all of the participants in this symposium is developing framings that will push society to a new vision of what is necessary if we really want to provide safe and consistent care for all children. It should push decision makers to understand that while parenting is central to children's development, and I want to emphasize that parenting is important, parenting is enormously shaped by context. And without changing the context that society gives to parents, we will never enable all parents to help the children achieve the outcomes that we desire. Our definition of the problem should set up the solutions we want to be considered and shape the narrative around implementation and evaluation.
Thank you, Michael. We actually only have about 35 seconds left in this segment, so I am going to move forward to the next set of questions. This will be a 20-minute segment, and we hope that everyone on the panel will be able to join in. This is the money question, and one of our attendees has already put a question in the chat about this. And so we know that the Department of Health and Human Services is governed by federal laws, and federal laws, or with federal laws comes funding, which typically incentivizes agency goals and outcomes. Miriam, you outlined in your paper how increased funding of the Social Security Act produced a $13 billion family regulation system, with nearly half of this amount going towards foster care. Michael, in your paper, you also note a variety of issues with the federal funding of the system. This system is in essence a federal and state business that funds the employment of thousands of caseworkers and administrators. So the second question for Miriam, or the first question for you is, could you expound on the way that the family regulation system currently operates to disenfranchise parents and children, and then share with us your ideas about how to dismantle the funding streams that do not serve to strengthen family bonds?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to all of my co-panelists and to everyone who worked tirelessly to bring this incredible symposium to fruition. To begin to understand the way that the family regulation system currently operates to disenfranchise parents and children, we really have to look at the history around the construction and the development of the modern family regulation system and ask ourselves, even where we see the family regulation system change its shape, what has been left firmly in place? What are the continuities that we see no matter how the family regulation system appears to transform? So in the paper that I wrote, I focus on and examine the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018, which has been lauded as a, quote, reordering of the foster system and the United States' approach to so-called, quote unquote, child welfare. A recognition that thus far the modus operandi of the family regulation system, which has been to regulate families through primarily family separation, is not working. But beginning in with the 1960s and 1970s amendments to the Social Security Act, then moving all the way to the Adoption and Safe Families Acts of 1997, federal family regulation system policy has funded and indeed incentivized the removal of children to the foster system. Key to accessing the largest pots of federal funding available to states was the requirement that children for whom the funds were allocated be removed from their homes to the foster system. And this led to the system where the majority of the money spent by the federal government was to support state foster systems, a system in which Black children, as Professor Roberts noted last night, that Black children were vastly overrepresented at a rate of 2.26, their general population, and Indigenous children were equally overrepresented. A system where Black children have reports of maltreatment allegations made against them and investigated by state regulation authorities, where Black families are more likely to have those cases substantiated, and where Black children are more likely to be removed from their home to the foster system, and where Black children are more likely to have their familial bonds ended with termination of parental rights than any other children. And as Professor Roberts has previously pointed out, it's often forgotten that state agents forcibly remove most of these children and that their mothers are intensely supervised by the child welfare authorities as they comply with agency requirements to be reunified with their children. This state intrusion is typically viewed as necessary to protect maltreated children from parental harm, but the need for intervention is usually linked to poverty, racial injustice, and the state's approach to caregiving, which addresses family economic deprivation with child removal rather than services and financial resources. So now we look at the current federal family regulation policy in the Family First Act, and it does usher in some changes as to how states, the needs that states must meet to access this funding. But what's important to look at is what the Family First Act leaves firmly in place. And when we interrogate that question, we see that the fundamental pillars upon which the family regulation system was built have endured, and in some respects have been strengthened. And so when I'm talking about these pillars, what I'm talking about is pathology, it's control, and it's punishment. It's the very aspects of the system that Professor Roberts pointed out 20 years ago. And those aspects are still firmly in place, even though they may fall under the ambit of prevention. So when I talk about pathology, what I mean is the system's myopic focus on what the system deems as parental deficits. And Angeline spoke to this, Michael just spoke to this. It in turn obviates the need for the federal family regulation policy to interrogate the very structural factors that produce marginalization and families' adversities. So when maltreatment is pathological, when maltreatment can be found and located solely within the parent, the family regulation system policy, there's no need to grapple with, much less address and transform problems such as racism and poverty. There's only a need to focus on changing and modifying and shifting the parent and the parent's behaviors. Pathology remains central to how the family regulation system currently operates under the Family First Act. And when we talk about control, the current family regulation system continues to operate with expansive control and coercion over families, from investigation and surveillance that extends to every corner of families' lives, and indeed reaches far beyond the family to friends and other family members and other service providers that are working to assist families, from doctors to teachers to shelters to social workers. There is truly no aspect of a person's life, especially when you are talking about families who are parenting on the margins, Black families, Indigenous families, Latinx families, poor families. There is no realm of their life that is off limits to these service providers and to service providers that function really as de facto agents of the family regulation system. And I know I'm getting close to my time, so I will wrap up shortly. But I also wanted to note that finally punishment remains central to the family regulation system. The Family First Act did nothing to remove the state's fundamental power to separate children from their parents, fundamental power to terminate familial bonds, and that power that the state has coerces families to complying with the family regulation system that under the Family First Act is the whole purpose of it is to move upstream and to be involved deeply in people's lives earlier. So when we talk about what is the shift that's needed to dislodge these pillars of pathology and control and punishment, the only shift that I see here is the shift that so many people like Angeline, like Joyce McMillan, like Dorothy Roberts, so many people have been calling for so long. And that is to destroy the family regulation system and invest money and resources directly in the community, because community knows how to take care of each other. And there is no way to invest money in the same government institution that is prosecuting you, that has the power to take your children, that has the power to end your familial bonds. There is no way to reorder that system such that it's not a system of pathology, control, and punishment. So with that, I will pause because I know we want to hear from some other folks.
Yes, so I know there were actually most of the panelists did address this issue of funding. Angela and Angeline, I know that you also addressed it, and I wanted to offer you the opportunity to speak to what you covered in your paper with respect to the difference in how money is allocated across the board.
Sure, thank you. And as everyone else has mentioned, I'd like to thank everyone, the organizers, and all of you who are joining us in community today to talk about this very timely and urgent situation that Black families and other marginalized families are facing, and to join with us in a call to action to move forward to really address the situation in a very urgent and emergency crisis level manner. To address the question, just to add on a little bit to what has been said already, in terms of how the system disenfranchises families. I think that what we addressed in our paper together, Angeline and I, was the actual impact on the lived experience of children and their parents and their families in communities as a result of the system. The system undermines the functioning of families, intact families, and destroys their ability to thrive by this fixation on pathology, by this fixation on investigation, on separation, and on surveillance and behavioral control, otherwise known as preventive services. And while failing to provide concrete supports and disrupting families, causing additional emotional and financial stress on families already operating on the margins. Not only that, but it disrupts children's stability and the connections to their family, to their culture, as one of the panelists mentioned last night. And so what we talk about in disenfranchisement is that we're spending billions of dollars to, as Angeline said, actually destroy families. I'd like to give a few statistics. I'm always kind of dredging up, like, what are the numbers? Where's the money spent? I was just reading a report by Child Trends, which noted that in 2018, 13% of the federal dollars, and Miriam has mentioned $13 billion from the federal government to the states on quote unquote child welfare, the family policing system, 13%. Only 13% of those dollars and 15% of state and local child welfare funds were spent on what's called preventive services. The largest share of that 13% was spent on quote unquote parent skill-based programs and caseworker visits, which basically add up to information and referral services and family team meetings, which is basically another information gathering investigative function to show that parents have maltreated their children. Only 6% of federal and 7% of state and local preventive services funding went to financial supports for families. In New York City, according to the Finance Division of the New York City Council report on the fiscal 2021 financial plan issued in March of 2020, The 2021 budget for New York City's Child Welfare Agency, the Administration for Children's Services, totaled $2.69 billion. The report identifies the core ACS responsibilities as investigating child abuse and placing children into foster care. The children's services provided by 7,424 ACS employees consist of investigations, child removal, and casework to the tune of $537.5 million. More than half of that 2.6 billion, goes to 573 private contractors of quote unquote preventive foster and adoption services, which Ms. Miriam describes as basically surveillance, monitoring for compliance, and also collecting evidence to be reported to the courts. During the pandemic, the Citizens Committee for Children noted that during the pandemic, these community service providers pivoted and started to focus on providing actual concrete services to families that they were not providing before, including alleviating food and housing insecurity, providing essential material supports and services such as cash, groceries, diapers, baby formula, and offering remote academic supports for students. They also heard that preventive services programs stepped in to help families pay cell phone bills, purchase phones and tablets, or pay for broadband. Now, during that same time, ACS has now implemented a new child welfare, quote, preventive services system starting July 1st that again emphasizes what Angeline and I call in our paper, trauma pimping, right? Which is basically these quote unquote preventive services that are really behavioral social control programming. Thank you.
Okay, Marty or Michael, if you would like to add your thoughts about what you discussed in your paper with respect to how money incentivizes outcomes.
Marty, do you want to go, or I'm happy to go?
I'm happy to join the conversation, and as everyone else has, I want to thank the organizers and the brilliant speakers last night, and I'm honored to be on this panel today. You know, it's always hard in a few minutes to capture my thoughts on this field, but everything we've already heard this morning is spot on. We have a system that requires surveillance of families who rely on public systems to help raise their children, whether that's the schools, the hospitals, or any related idea. We pay handsomely to remove children, and we offer astonishing fiscal incentives to destroy families. So we could call this system the family surveillance system, the child removal system, the family destruction system. All are far more apt than child welfare. But child welfare is the accepted term because it's an important version of propaganda in the United States, a version that government officials and the child welfare establishment cares deeply about continuing to make the claim that the proof that the United States cares about children living in poverty, despite all evidence to the contrary, is that it has the most ambitious, expensive child welfare so-called system in the world. But it's a violent field. It's a field that terrorizes communities. And most importantly, it permits the masking of the truth that this is a country that refuses to ensure that children are able to be raised safely and in a healthy way, even when they are born into poverty. Quite the opposite. We are at the very bottom of the list of the countries in the world with whom we like to be compared. And we make up for that deeply, pathologically, and to the grave harm of families that live in poverty by piling on the slander that they are unfit people. And we really have a culture that no longer talks the way we did during the peak of social Darwinist language in the United States at the end of the 19th century, where the Connecticut Supreme Court called the families currently enmeshed in this system a worthless class of people. That idea remains prevalent in this country.
If I could come in briefly with maybe a little bit of a different take or a couple of different points. A lot of the problems that are being raised now are problems that have been identified for more than 50 years. I've been working on this for a very long time. Marty has a number of other people. So I think that a critical question for us moving forward is, why have we not been able to move forward in a more successful way? We've talked about the funding streams, about the over-removal around a range of issues. And I just want to make a couple of points at this point that as we move toward abolition or greatly reducing this scope, thinking about how the structure would look like and what is necessary to make it work is going to be really critical. And in that regard, I want to address two separate issues. First of all, I believe that without changing any funding streams whatsoever and thinking about it in any way, that we could reduce the child protection system by 80% of all cases tomorrow, that we could stop intake in 80% of all of the cases. I addressed that specifically, how to do that in the paper, in my paper. But what I want to point out is that of 80% of all of the cases that are investigated and brought into the system through an investigation, the child protection system does nothing afterwards now. It diverts to relatively meaningless differential response services, which don't reach most people in an effective way, or it just closes the cases altogether. So if we were not to do anything in those 80% of cases, it wouldn't make any difference in terms of how the system operates. And we ought to do that right now by changing reporting laws and by focusing only on the somewhere around 10 to 15% of reports that involve a situation that might be a threat of current, imminent, serious harm to a child, and take all of the other cases out tomorrow without any funding stream changes. But if we build a new system, several things need to be thought about with regard to funding that have been very big barriers for a long period of time. First of all, there are a lot of the families who do come in do need services around not only poverty and housing and income related, but a number do need services around mental and physical health, around substance problems, around domestic violence that are going on, a range of things. And the parents say that, the parents I work with. But our funding now is completely divided in silos, where there's a certain part for mental health, a certain part for domestic violence, etc. The silos each have constituencies, and it's hard to break them down, even though the amount of money and resources needed in different communities really vary. So we need to break the silos to begin with. Secondly, there is a lack of coordination across services, so that a family has to go to 5 different places to get mental health or family violence or whatever else. We need to have a coordinated set of services that have a different structure of delivery. And finally, and this may be controversial and difficult to do, I think the only way we will get to breaking down the silos and the lack of coordination is to have something that allows flexibility at the local level in how the money is used, something along a block grant kind of thing with a local structure that allows all these funds to be put into a single pot and then used wherever most needed in particular communities. I just want to say a last thing on that. All of the silos have big constituencies that want to continue their money. And it's going to be very hard to break down those silos unless alliances are created with a range of constituencies who begin to work together in a way that they never have before.
Thank you, all of you, for those insights and for the suggestions. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and just so that everyone knows, I'm making note of your questions, and we're going to try to circle back to them once we wrap up the discussion, but some of the discussion will include answers to your questions. And so our discussion about, or your answers with respect to money and the flow of money, and Michael, particularly your last question about silos, leads us to talk about the specific federal laws that make up the family regulation system, and there are a host of them. Miriam spoke earlier about the Family First Prevention Services Act, but I wanted to talk or discuss how the family regulation system works as it pertains to monitoring families whose children are in foster care, or policing families, if we want to use that term, particularly African-American families. So those state agencies direct and conduct the field work of the system. It is framed by federal laws that govern the mission of state family interventions. And each of your papers does focus on either one or several different federal laws that have impacted state control over families who enter the system. Can each of you talk about the primary federal law you examined in your paper and why you chose to write about its role in regulating families? And so this segment will be about 22 minutes for everyone. So just be mindful to keep your answers to about 5 minutes.
So Jessica, please interrupt me if I'm, when I'm getting to that point where I'm running over, because I will lose track, and I'll get started. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of jump in is because the working title of the co-authored piece that Angeline and I wrote is called "Toward Community Control of Child Welfare Funding: Repeal the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and delink child protection from family well-being." Our paper is focused on what's called CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and it has several different components. One component is a sort of historical background that delves into the beginnings of the Child Protective Services System, which was created by CAPTA, and also connects directly the requirements and the components of that law to the everyday lived experience of what happens to children and families when that statute gets implemented on the ground. So Angeline, so part of our paper is Angeline's actual experience, which shows how the federal law impacts the daily lived experience of families in the family policing system. So CAPTA was enacted in 1974 and is actually the foundational federal law, as I said, that's established the so-called Child Protective System, or CPS. I like to call it the family policing system, along with Dorothy Roberts, because that is what it does. That is what it is set up to do. It's a nationwide system of, despite its name about prevention and treatment, it is actually a nationwide system of investigation, reporting, and prosecution in court of parents for alleged maltreatment or threat of maltreatment of their children. And so, as I said, prevention and treatment is highlighted. We've talked a little bit about what those preventive services actually look like, which is the surveillance, monitoring, and oversight of families. So my approach to looking at CAPTA came after I started to read through the hundreds of pages of testimony that were elicited by Congress in the 4 days of congressional hearings in 1973, led by Senator Walter Mondale. And I started to notice that there was not a lot of mention of neglect or conditions of poverty, except as a side issue. And most of the testimony focused on the sort of brutal, sensationalist, physical abuse of children. And so I started to wonder, how did neglect actually get caught up in this system? And I would, as an aside, say that I agree totally with Michael, that one of the first things that we can do is to remove neglect altogether, and conditions of poverty framed as a neglect altogether from the CPS system. And that would be a huge and tremendous start to abolishing the system altogether. Anyway, what was striking from that research was that the entire CPS, or child welfare system, is premised on this concept of child protection. And that concept is based on an ideology of parental dangerousness. To quote sociologist and psychologist Leroy Pelton, CAPTA's central organizing principle is that the most widespread threats to the safety and well-being of children stem from the misbehaviors of their parents. And this is the generating ideology underlying the entire system. Brian Stevenson often refers to the presumption of Black dangerousness and guilt. And this is something that is ubiquitous in the American psyche and society. This presumption of Black dangerousness and guilt also underlies the Child Protection Service's treatment of Black mothers, particularly, and fathers and children in this system. That pathology or pathologizing of families comes from the work of Dr. Henry Kempe, which is he is the founder of the Kempe Center in Colorado. Dr. Kempe was a major driver of the adoption of this medicalized model of parental pathology as the underlying political frame of the nation's response to child abuse and neglect. And as Angeline talks about in parts of the paper, the pathology drives so much of what happens to parents in the system. They're forced to undergo psychological evaluations. They're forced to go to various services that really have nothing to do with what brought them into the system. And this is one of the drivers of how parents and families are disrespected and surveilled and monitored in the system.
Okay, Angela, let me have you pause for just a moment because we're at 16 minutes. So I want to let others chime in, and then we'll come back. We should have some time at the end. Okay, so cool. Definitely CAPTA, and I know there are other particular federal acts. The Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 was covered by Marty, and we'll come back to you, Angela, okay?
So I do focus on and enjoyed titling the paper "The Worst Law Ever Enacted." ASPA is a hideous law, full stop. But an important story of ASPA is that it is celebrated in this country as a beautiful act. You know, there aren't that many people that cheer when we execute prisoners. There are a few, but we usually relegate them to a sorry place. On the other hand, the child welfare establishment, judges, children's lawyers, agencies, foundations, name them all, dance at the execution of families, celebrate it as a great thing, because the goal of child welfare since 1997 is permanence. And they are agnostic about how to achieve permanence. Never mind that terminating parental rights creates legal orphans who endure a hideous concept of being familyless people, rejected by everyone by state decree, who age out of the system and are given a bus ticket and some support the way a prisoner is released on furlough. Never mind that. But we celebrate the destruction of family since 1997. And, you know, Angela just told us about Dr. Kemp, and the Journal of American JAMA, in an editorial when Kemp made his findings, predicted that we will learn that children suffer serious physical injury from child abuse as the leading cause of danger to them in the country, higher than leukemia, they said in this preposterous editorial. But Black children in the United States are 7 times more likely to be the victim of having their parents' rights terminated than of contracting cancer, which is the leading cause of death by disease of children. 1 in every 100 children in the United States experience a termination of parental rights. 1 in every 285 children in the United States will be diagnosed with cancer during that period, of which 70 to 97% will survive. We have a world in which it is organized that the one thing we do in this country that truly makes us outstanding, there are actually 2. One outstanding thing is the degree to which we fail to provide the opportunity for families living in poverty to thrive. And we make up for that by destroying families at a world record pace. You know, when we executed juveniles until 2005, we were shamed by the world into changing that. And it only happened 16 years ago. But we continue to exercise capital punishment in families, not just at a record-breaking pace, but along with our cheering it on. It is a disgusting, sad picture.
And if I could just jump in after Marty and sort of speak to the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018. I think the question that Michael asked earlier was a really good question. Why have we not been able to move forward in a more productive way? You know, after all of these years of investigating the failures, just the tremendous failures of the family regulation system, why have we not been able to move forward? And part of that, I think, is because of how money is allocated. So then that leads to the question of why do we continue to allocate money and funding and structure the family regulation system in the way that we do when we see that it's a failure? And so perhaps that leads us to conclude that the family regulation system is not a failure at all. It is doing precisely what it is designed to do, right? Which is to maintain the status quo, to maintain marginalization, to maintain Black, brown, and poor people in the very position that they are today. And the way that we maintain the status quo is what Angela, Angeline, what Marty has spoken to, what Michael has spoken to. There is this commitment to the propaganda that it is the parent that is the problem, that it is the parent that needs to be changed, right? That is the recalcitrant behavior of the parent that is the issue. And so then we continue to invest, as Angela said, in this behavior modification programs, as opposed to, it's not rocket science, right? We know that giving people money, creates more stability in families. It enables folks to be able to access housing, enables folks to be able to access mental health services, all of the things that create stability, all of the things that people in wealthy communities have access to. If we just provided those services to families who are enmeshed in the family regulation system, then we know that some of these issues, right, would shift. And what I'm talking about, because some people may point and say, well, wait, that's what the Family First Prevention Services Act does. It opens up prevention services, it opens up mental health services. But when you have mental services that are provided through the prosecutor, where your therapist has to respond to your prosecutor, well, your substance abuse counselor will report your relapse, which is absolutely expected when you are dealing with substance use disorder, will report that. And that is an indictment on your parenting. And that is the basis on which they steal your children. That is not the shift that we need to be moving towards. And my interest in the Family First Prevention Services was precisely that, where everyone is lauding this act of opening up tons and tons of money that was otherwise reserved for removing children to the foster system to providing these prevention services. And is that the fundamental shift, or is that the shift away from this punitive, violent system that we previously had? And the answer is no, right? And we can spend time talking about the impetus for the Family First Prevention Services Act and its link to the opioid crisis, but I don't believe we have time to go there today. So I want to just really sort of spend some time to look at what the Family First Prevention Services Act actually funds. Now, Angela referenced the in-home parenting skills programs. The Family First Prevention Services Act also opens up funding for parents to be able to access mental health programs and also substance abuse programs before the child has been removed to the foster system, and where there's been a determination that the child is at risk of being removed to the foster system. And what we see is that the core ideology in prevention continues to be the notion that the parents' behaviors and choices are to blame for their circumstances that led to the family's involvement in the family regulation system. If you look at the prevention model and the protective factors, what goes into that, the primary question is, how do we make children and parents more resilient so that they can deal with the circumstances under which they live? The question is not, how do we shift the circumstances? The question is not, as Marty put it, why do we continue to allow so many children and families in this country to live in abject poverty, to look away from that? That is because we are invested in blaming it on the parents. So you have these prevention services that come in and support families by helping them understand how to be more resilient, instead of asking, why do we ask you to be so resilient in the first place? Why do we relegate Black and brown and poor folks to resilience instead of actually providing them with the material resources like housing, right? Like actual stipends, like healthcare that does not criminalize them and penalize them for dealing with struggles that all of us have to deal with, right? expansive control. The Family First Act just shifts the nature of coercion and control from immediate removal of children to the foster system to the threat of removal if you do not comply with the mandates of the foster system, which, by the way, the whole design of the Family First Prevention Services Act is to have the family regulation system and its, tentacles enter a family's life earlier, more upstream. So that means compliance earlier and for longer periods of time. The Family First Prevention Services Act, as we talked about earlier, requires service plans and ongoing periodic risk assessments, right? And while we cannot underestimate the violence of disappearing children to the foster system, akin to incarceration or deportation, the persistent and unconstrained government monitoring and supervision is not benign. And the threat of family separation, to know that constantly the threat of family separation can be equally as traumatic. And these are entire neighborhoods, these are entire communities, right? And I think before I want to leave some time for Michael to join in as well, but I said earlier that we haven't sort of seen a change over the last 50 years because there is this investment in maintaining the status quo, because it has been shown throughout the history of the United States that family separation can be used as a tool of control, because when you break families and communities, you impact a community's ability to resist the very systems and the very structures that keep them, that maintain them enmeshed in the family regulation system, right? And so shifting money to the prosecutors being embedded in prevention services and making families more resilient is not the answer. And that's what the Family First Prevention Services Act is.
Okay, let me just take a pause here before anyone responds, because we only have about 16 minutes left. And there's actually a question that I wanted to direct to Angeline, and then we're going to wrap up with some closing remarks to bring in some of the suggestions that you all brought up in your papers. And so, Angeline, I wanted to ask you, we've been talking about these federal laws, and you went through 5 years of fighting to get your son returned to you after he was removed at age 2. And so I wanted to ask you about your description of the family regulation system as webs of complicated, complex labyrinths where parents and children are thrown further and further into the belly of the beast and unable to be reunified. So can you explain what you mean by this and how your struggle to get your son back spurred your advocacy in this space?
So I want to start by saying that I experienced everything that my co-panelists have said, control, social control, coercion, investigation, punishment, and surveillance. So when I think of the foster care experience, I think of a labyrinth. I think of a place where parents are thrown in, parents are stuck, and it's very hard to get out. I have been fighting to get my son back for 5 years. So I've had a lot of times to think about and figure out my circumstances. Looking back, the labyrinth is the best metaphor. The system as a beast with a revolving need for more and more and more children. And once parents are in, it is very hard to get out. Parents are stuck. And if parents stay in there for too long, then the clock starts ticking, and TPR, termination of parental rights. One of the problems that I experience is the conflict of interest. There are many conflict of interest in the system. So the people put in place to support families and guide families work for the family destruction system are not really helping families. The perfect example is, for example, ACS, the Child Welfare Agency in New York City, who has the role of prosecuting parents and also helping and supporting parents. That's a conflict of interest. The other issue that I experienced was the high turnover rate for the caseworkers. Case planning halts whenever a caseworker resigns, and that happened very often. Poor case planning meant that children stay in foster care longer. The other issue is the poor quality of the legal representation. I myself had to learn the law. I had to fire my attorneys. I had to do my own representation. I spent a lot of time at the law library. Every time I came to court, I had a written motion. I mean, the judge expected every time I came to court, she was going to tell me to be quiet, you know. Every time I came to court, I was told to be silenced. And that's what I really experienced. I was silenced in every step of the way. And one of the things that I realized, I know that Angela and Mary and Marty and Michael spoke about the federal funding. I just couldn't understand why my son was in a foster care system, right? The executive, the president of the foster care agency was making $600,000 a year. And that's the research that I had to do, you know, look for and investigate their financial documents. He was making $600,000 a year. And the only type of housing they were offering to parents and children was a shelter. So I really didn't understand that. And I questioned that. And I sent emails about that because I saw that as a form of injustice. I had to write a 10-page motion, verbal written motion to recuse the judge from my case. So these are all the things I had to do. It's because I had the resources to do all of that. And I felt a lot of pain about parents who really were stuck in that labyrinth and weren't able to, you know, to escape. And I also realized how most of the judges were immoral, unethical, and they played a major role in keeping children in the system. I felt that most of them didn't care about Black parents and they didn't care about Black children. So once my advocacy started, once I reached the point of my awakening, of course, the only response that they had for me was to retaliate, right? So rampant retaliation exists for parents who are strong advocates. The number one reaction is to make it harder and harder for parents to reunify. And that's when I had experienced punishment in the system. So I am going to speak about Kurt Mondorf because in 2016, when I was stuck in the labyrinth, I actually started to do a lot of research. I encountered Kurt Mondorf, who used to be an ACS caseworker. He wrote a great essay called Children as Chattel, Invoking the 13th Amendment to Reform the Child Welfare System. This is what he said. I saw the agency steamroll many dozens of innocent families. They became involved in a system that was capricious, abusive, and which seems to do more harm than good. The only help we offered was to place children in foster care. There seems to be no intention of helping parents. Very quickly, it became clear to me that the help of foster care was no help at all. While I met some warm, caring foster parents, the vast majority of foster parents I met were obviously in it for the money. They were baby boarders. Foster parents are not the only people who profit from the child protective process. I began to see myself as part of a vast array of professionals who earn their income by providing services to families and their children. We provided a vast array of services, which I quickly came to realize were ineffective and at times even harmful to the people who we were supposed to be helping. Parents also did not see services as helping. Services were a series of hoops they had to jump through to get my agency out of their lives. At each hoop was another professional accepting money from the state. The more hoops, the more money. So I use this quote because I think this quote basically exemplifies everything that I had to go through in the system, you know? And once I became an advocate, it then became easier for my child to get out. People were advising me, telling me, you know, you need to keep quiet. You know, if you express, you know, your thoughts and opinion about the system, they're actually going to do more harm to your case. And that's exactly what happened. You know, that's exactly what happened. And people are wondering, wow, how come your child stayed in the system for so long? And I tell them, I was a victim of retaliation, you know, punishment. I mean, that's just how it works. And I would like to end by a quote from Dorothy Roberts. from her book, Shattered Bonds, there's a quote when she actually interviewed a lawyer who's filed a lawsuit on behalf of the children in Chicago. So the lawyer's name is Rifkin Karoter. So Rifkin Karoter suggests a reason for this assault on Black families. She says it's all about money. It's as simple as that. The top earning 10 private agencies that manage cases for DCFS have contract worth an average of $10 million. These agencies are involved in a lucrative business that depends on keeping children in the system. The more children placed in foster care and the longer they are kept there, the more money the agencies make. There is no financial incentive, on the other hand, to reunite children quickly with their families. They can't make money if the children are returned home. And I'm going to make that point. They cannot make any money if the children are returned home. So Dorothy Roberts asks, so why are Black families targeted? Why has there been disparity in the treatment of African Americans for the last 300 years? Anytime there's a social agency that discriminates against us, they are going to claim that it is for our benefit. The funds are going to be put in there with white people in charge. They make all the money and say, we have to service all of these poor Black people. And it's always going to happen until we can get our own agencies and that independent and will fight to do the right thing for us. Lastly, so she continues and says, my clients want injunctive relief. They want DCFS to change the way it treats Black parents and children. We want Black children to be treated like white children. We want Black families to receive the same services, and we want them to be judged the same standards. So that was in 2002. I think we want, right now, I would say we want more than to have Black children treated like white children. We want Black children and Black families treated like human beings. You know, we want basically, and I'm not even going to make that comparison between Black children and white children. I think right now we want the system to be abolished. I am of the strong opinion that is the way to create a new system. We don't want any more of these reforms because, as Dorothy Roberts said yesterday, reforms only gives them the weapon to strengthen that system that they created. So we want the system to be abolished.
Okay, I want to just interrupt just quickly. We have 6 minutes left, and I know that in 6 minutes, the rest of you will not be able to wrap up your papers for the audience, but I would like to actually expand the conversation and include some of the audience questions because we have so many of them. And I believe that in answering the audience questions, we will come to sort of a wrap up of what you all think. The last question that I had for you all was, what does a new system of care look like? And how should the community be included in this change? Many of the questions that have come in the chat, some of them are suggestions, but I want to start with Rita Rodriguez's question. And she says, yes, the legal framework is racist. She just keeps coming back to the same question. Can we make rich white people actually see poor and indigenous families as fully human? And that picks up on Angeline's last point. But if we're abolishing the system, then what are we replacing it with, or what are we putting in place that will assist families, poor families, in caring for their children? And Angeline, you mentioned putting in our own types of institutions. And so there are definitely organizations, nonprofits that have been started by, run by minority families, African-American women. And we have always had a system, even within our own communities, to support one another in the community. So I want you all to speak to that. And I know that some of you in your paper, Michael, you mentioned in your paper a particular program in North Carolina, Family Connects. And I want you all to speak to some of the ways that we can abolish the system and create something new.
And I'll just jump in real quick because there's, is not rocket science, first of all, right? Like there's money there. Stop connecting resources, not services, resources, childcare, rent control and subsidies and housing, right? We don't need to connect those resources to some idea that parents are threatening to harm their children or harming their children. That needs to just stop, right? So that's not rocket science. And there's millions of dollars, billions of dollars available to recreate the way we care, as Dorothy says, as Dorothy Roberts says, the way we care for people, the way we care for human beings, right? The other thing that I wanted to mention is that in our paper, we make a call for reparations. And that is something that we think is a meaningful, useful, essential part of this conversation to be lifted up as a priority, right? And there are numerous ways that children and families, Black families who have been impacted by this system can start to get the resources and the things and money that they need in order to repair the damage and the harm that has been done over generations and generations, right? And so I just wanted to make the point that reparations is certainly a high priority and should be a high priority for the abolition movement as we decide and talk about what needs to be put in place in order to address the harms and also reduce the harms toward abolishing the system altogether. And I would also like to make the point that in doing that, going back to Michael's point, we can stop the front door. We can shut the front door by removing, at least as a start, conditions of poverty related to neglect from the entire CPS system of investigation, reporting, investigation, and prosecution. I don't have any understanding of why we need to bring a family into court. Angeline talked about the whole court system. Why are we prosecuting families for poverty? And so if we can remove that entire 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the system involved families from the system by removing that as a grounds for reporting and investigating and prosecuting families, we can start to make some headway. Thank you.
Well, I think we're out of time, basically, but I would like to make one comment at this point. I have really learned a lot and profited a great deal from talking with the people in this panel, in particular, a lot of correspondence that I've had with Angela over this time that have been helpful in my thinking about this. But I want to take a slight amendment to what Angela just said, because I think otherwise we're going to have a conference 50 years from now that's going to be the same, okay? Actually, helping people is rocket science. Transferring money is easy and a very important part, but parents with a lot of money still struggle with parenting, still struggle with a lot of issues with children. Getting the kinds of services to these families is very difficult. These are complicated family situations that take much more than the capacity of our current institutions or something like mutual aid to actually address. And this has to be done in thousands of local communities across the country and within local communities. I think if we don't think about implementation and if we don't think about the science and the complexity of all of it, then we are going to be back. And let me just point out in that regard, New Zealand, which has much more of a social welfare system and strength system than we do in all kinds of ways. 25% of all children born in New Zealand are referred to Child Protective Services there. It's not just a United States problem, and it's not just a lack of spending money.
So, Jessica, let me add a coda here. First, I simply want to say out loud that the state is an abysmal parent. It doesn't love, it doesn't cry when a child is scared or alone or afraid or hungry or frightened. It lacks everything children need. It has proven itself for a generation to be abysmal at the task. It needs to be shut down. It does more harm than good. Its primary harm its primary value is the extent to which elected officials benefit from having this system. I've represented far too many families who have been irreversibly harmed inappropriately, all in the name of doing good. But, and here's the big but I want to emphasize, and it goes to this whole question of language and how we help shut this system down. So I urge everyone to re-listen to everything Miriam Mack has already said today. She's brilliant and concise and says it so solidly. But the one thing that might mislead is that she talked about how thoroughly the system regulates families, but it's only true for one segment of the community. And this is the signal feature of the problem. No one other than those who live in the communities affected by it have a clue. The system is ignored by virtually all professionals except for the professionals who built it. We would not have this system if it were true that it affected wealthy, white, and privileged families. We endure it because it does not. And it's run by well-meaning people who refuse to acknowledge their complicity in their work. There is no public outcry. This is a system supported by the courts, supported by local government, supported by children's groups, supported by the media, who celebrate the removal of children from dangerous homes, ignoring how infrequently that's the reason for it. It's supported by progressive legislators. And don't look to the progressive child welfare foundations either. They helped build this system. Think tanks and advocacy groups that support ASFA. You know, when in 1996, Congress eliminated welfare as we knew it, Peter Edelman resigned from the government. In 1997, Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund advocated for the draconian destruction of families that ASFA has created. We are in deep doo-doo here because we do not have support where we need it. But what's great about today, what I find to be hopeful in a way it never has been in my 50 years in this system, is the community's voice is finally being heard. And that's where all our hope lies. The Angeline Montalbans, the Joyce McMillans, they are our future, they are our hope, and without them, all is lost.
Thank you, Marty. I wanted to ask a couple of questions from the attendees. We have about 9 minutes left. And so some of the suggestions that have come from the attendees, Hillary Health Lab asked, would universal basic income be one way to ameliorate this situation? And a lot of the panelists, a lot of the attendees have asked about redirecting the money. And who do you redirect it to? Who can be trusted with the money? What community services, and how do you coordinate those services that are needed in the communities so that it would benefit the families and take that away from the government? So if y'all could speak to that.
Yeah, well, Michael probably has a whole lot more experience in thinking about this, but look, there's expertise. Like I don't have the answer to that, right? Because that's not my expertise, but there's expertise. So pull together a group of experts who know how to do that thing and then go from there. That would be my short answer. My uninformed, non-expert answer. Like, we have the capacity and the ability to figure this out. There are complex systems, business systems, all sorts of systems, thinkers who know how to do these sorts of things. So I think that the point that we're at, and along with Marty, is that we're at a point where we should be starting to demand that those sorts of things be put into place, right? One thing that Angeline talks about incessantly is accountability. Where is the accountability for the misuse and mismanagement of government taxpayer funds by, state agencies? Where's the efficiency audits of whether or not these agencies are using the monies for positive outcomes? We already know they're not. So why are they? So we need to be holding those agencies and the federal government itself accountable for the misuse of those funds, while at the same time we pull together the expertise to figure out how to make universal basic income happen, how to make childcare accessible without having to go through a child protective system, how to ensure that children are getting a great education and that the schools are not weaponizing poverty against families by reporting them to a child protective services agency. I will stop. Thank you.
And just to sort of jump in here, I think I want to, I think we're sort of dealing with two things, right? One, there's the family regulation system. There's the intervention that it makes into families' lives. And I think that Marty is correct in the sense that it does not intervene into everyone's lives. It intervenes into Black, Indigenous, and low-income people's lives. And so many of the people of privilege in this country are not only is it invisible to them, but they are quite comfortable with it being invisible to them, because that is what allows for the system to churn on and for people to continue to sort of sit with the knowledge that, as I said earlier, we relegate a certain population of this country to live in abject poverty. And the other sort of piece that I think that we're talking about is grappling with how do we respond to harm that happens in our communities, right? Yes, it is true that there is chaotic parenting in privileged communities, and there is also chaotic parenting in non-privileged communities. But what I think we are dealing with here today is that the government sees fit to socially engineer and intervene in the lives of only a specific group of people, and that is Black people, and that is Indigenous people, right? And so we have to reimagine how we interact with each other and the systems that we create to hold each other and hold harm in our communities. But as we have learned from prison abolitionists that have come before us and have already theorized this, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, like Mariame Kaba, like Rachel Hertzing, investing in the very systems that police us, investing in the very systems that were formed in order to police and to control and destroy, further investing in those systems is not the answer, right? We are not going to be able to reform a system that was built to do a thing that is policing and control and make it not police and control, because then it would no longer be that system. And I think that when, yes, I think it is true that perhaps getting money to people directly can be a sort of complex procedure, but also not. Right? We give foster parents thousands of dollars each and every month, right? We know how to give people money, and that is a place where we can start to transform the conditions under which people live. I think also, and Angela noted this when she was speaking earlier, that instead of having the benefits that we provide to people, healthcare, prenatal care, WIC, SNAP, public housing, instead of having to go through hoops and hoops and hoops and to report and to document, to prove that you should have the basic necessities that wealthy people take for granted. What if we just provided those benefits to people with no strings attached, so they don't have to report, so that they don't have to worry about all of the various forms and the myriad ways in which accessing these systems is incredibly complicated, unnecessarily so, right? And I think that when I think about sort of abolition, again, we have guiding lights in this space. We have Mariame Kaba, we have Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And we know that abolitionist steps are about, and these are not my words, this is from Critical Resistance, abolitionist steps are about gaining ground in the constant effort to radically transform society and chipping away at oppressive institutions rather than helping them live longer. And so what that looks like, I can name off the top of my head programs that exist today that are radical programs providing support to people. Ancient Song Doula Services in Brooklyn, Bronx Rebirth providing doula services in the Bronx. We have, St. Anne's Corner of Harm Reduction in the Bronx that's providing support to people. We can look to harm reduction principles in order to provide support to people. And I also think, and I would encourage us to again, along with abolitionist principles, to not rely so heavily on government to provide our answers. Like, yes, people need the money, but once people need the money, we don't need government intervention and organizing. People know how to take care of themselves. They need the material resources to be able to do so.
Thank you, Miriam. All right, we only have 2 minutes left until the breakout rooms. So I am going to read out some questions that hopefully those of you who asked can go to the breakout rooms and ask these of the particular panelists. There were definitely people who asked about whether people should still be foster parents in this system. If once we reimagine it, people asked about accountability for the state with respect to what they're doing in the lives of families. And Richard Wexler asked a good question about whether or not, or he basically indicated that Angela was right in saying that helping families is not rocket science, but eradicating bias is harder. And so I think in thinking about how we reimagine this system, we still are faced with the same biases that people have with respect to whoever is servicing the families that do have actual physical abuse and sexual abuse in their family. So once we take neglect out of it, are there still things that we need to do in order to ensure that the system does not do the same things that it's already doing? And so there are a lot of different questions. I would love to be able to give everyone the opportunity to wrap up. But what I will do now is tell you which rooms every panelist will be in. And so the first breakout room will be Angela Burton and Angeline Montalban. The second breakout room will be Martin Guggenheim. The third breakout room will be Miriam Mack. And the fourth breakout room is Michael Wald. And again, if you're not able to self-select because you have an older version of Zoom, once 11:45 hits, which is now, if you need help, just go to a person with AV at the beginning of their name, and they can put you in the breakout room that you would desire to be in. So right now, we're going to switch to breakout rooms for the next 15 minutes. And at the end, at 1 o'clock, we'll start with the next panel. Thank you so much to the panelists. This was an awesome discussion. I wish we had more time. And everyone has great ideas. The papers are incredible. I hope that everyone has an opportunity to read them. They will be published in the Columbia Journal of Race and the Law. And with that, we will start the breakouts.